Now we're actually starting the work of creating our scheme. And I'd advise you to have a break between watching each of these 3 videos and take some time to consolidate and note down your thoughts. So the learning outcomes for this video are to define the skills for success for your module or your modules, and to link these skills to your lesson intended learning outcomes and teaching and learning activities, things we've talked about in the core concept videos. So let's return to the BIM template again. So it's broken down into 3 sections. So we've got a module overview, transferable skills, and the week-by-week lesson plans. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend just starting at the top and working down, but it's certainly a good idea to sketch out the first 2 sections before you start on the rest. So where should you start? So this is the planning teaching cycle. Most of you who've taught the module before are somewhere in between steps 3 and 1. So you've already gone through a cycle of actually teaching, now you're evaluating, and you're making plans for the next year. So we're going to start at the planning stage and then skip back to step 3 in the next video, and then go back to step 1 to refine what we've come up with. So rather than just building on what is on the existing scheme, put that to one side for a minute and consider what you want your students to achieve. What are the big goals? What knowledge, understanding and skills do your students need to demonstrate in order to meet the module learning outcomes and pass the assessment at base level? And how do you envisage students applying that knowledge? Think about the level. Are you aware of the generic criteria for that level? As in year 1, year 2, year 3, level 4, 5 and 6, because this will help you distinguish between that base level of achievement and what you expect from the higher achievers in your classes. And this diagram kind of demonstrates the fact that you really do need to be considering skills alongside knowledge and understanding when you're considering how your module aligns. So perhaps the most obvious place to start with this process is to think about what you want your students to know, so the content or the declarative knowledge. And the module guide is a good starting place, and they include key study areas and topics that you're expected to cover. But do remember that a lot of these module guides are quite a few years old, even the Sussex ones. In fact, they might even be older than some of our ones. So you do have license here to expand on what's in the books. Make the most of your own experiences, build on your strengths because that's why you're here, and I think a good way of doing this is to create a concept dialogue map. And so this helps you to connect the different concepts and think carefully about the level of understanding you want your students to be able to achieve. So those of you who've done the PG Cert probably know Neil Few. He's done some great work with BIM before, and he's actually done a whole video on how to create a concept dialogue map. So I'll link to it in the links section of this chapter. But do check that out if you want some guidance on how to start kind of piecing together all the topics that you want to cover. And another thing to think about here is what informs your content. So obviously you've got your experience, which is extremely valuable. You also need to integrate other perspectives, other experiences, core texts and other resources. So this is a good time to review the reading list, which you'll find at the end of your module guide. There are usually 5 core texts that have been picked out. Review it. If it's not fit for purpose, if it's not current enough, check the dates of publications. Then you might want to update it before you do this. And you can submit your new core text requests to your course leader or to me. And then once you have some text you're happy with, you should be referring to those texts in your scheme of work somewhere, and you should be reading and keeping up to date with your field of study, and making sure that you are supporting the content that you deliver in lessons with some external resources, because that is of course what we expect students to do when it comes to assessment. So now we need to think about skills. The majority of BIM assessments do not solely test declarative knowledge, so the ability to remember facts and figures and reel off things, it's not really what higher education is about. They're actually going to have to do something with that knowledge. And the basics of this are usually explicit in the module learning outcomes. So have a look at those, look at the active verbs and the assessment tasks. So what are they actually required to do when it comes to assessment time? And then think about how can you create an environment in class, so an active learning environment that allows students to practice these skills and receive plenty of feedback on their progress along the way. So you'll have those things explicit in the learning outcomes, and then there are plenty of transferable skills that aren't explicit. So, I mean, otherwise they'd be probably ridiculously long, or there'd be loads and loads of learning outcomes. But things like academic skills, personal development are really important to embed in your lessons. So in the first core concepts video, we looked at metacognition and how that really strengthens learning. So those skills are really important. And then the skills that are kind of explicit in the generic grading schemes for each year. So those academic skills that perhaps we just assume students are going to be able to do. So you can't expect even the students that have done Pete's 10-week course in higher learning skills to be confident in transferring the academic skills to a new context without some kind of support. You know, these skills take a long time to develop, and there is no way that one person, however wonderful Pete is going to be able to get every student up to the level that they're going to be able to transfer those skills to your subject. So it is important to embed these, to think about which of the academic skills are most important in your module. And if your lesson is mostly practical but contains perhaps a small written element, you will want to dedicate some time throughout the year to developing that, not just what's the assessment the week before? So if we can define the most important skills and create an environment which helps students develop these skills alongside the key knowledge and understanding we've got ourselves, and aligned curriculum. And as a side note, you want to make sure that you get the level right so that expectations for students are clear and consistent. So you can check the course learning outcomes, the generic criteria. These are both in the course handbooks, the generic criteria, the generic grading scheme, and all your assessment briefs. And remember that Peter Spivey, the academic support tutor, is always happy to provide guidance, support and resources if you need a little help embedding things like academic skills into your lessons. So let's look at an example. We're going to go back to music business again. So let's have a look at the module learning outcomes. We've got identify and analyse the structure and mechanics of the current music industry. You've seen that one before. Evaluate current developments in the music industry, demonstrating knowledge of changes in industry practice and audience demands. And produce work showing evidence of effective reading and research, demonstrating applied citation and referencing to academic conventions. And the assessment task here is an essay, it's a 2,500 word essay. And the marking criteria, we have the generic marking scheme for level 4, which we will take a quick look at. I'm not going to put the whole thing here, but we've got the descriptions of work in the 40s, 50s and 60s, which is where we'd expect most students to be. So the key things that we can pick out here that will apply to a successful essay, which is their assessment task, are presentation, structure, supporting evidence, supporting their knowledge and ideas, and referencing. So, I've brainstormed some key skills based on these three things. So the learning outcomes, the assessment format, and generic criteria. And this is what I have come up with. So let's look at these skills for success to begin with. So we have identify, and that relates back to this first learning outcome. So want students to be able to identify key things, to be able to explain, to be able to select. To read, and I've gone a bit further with reading because we know that reading is quite a passive activity, but from their reading to be able to summarise, paraphrase and critique, because it's these things that are actually the really useful skills in terms of actually putting an essay together, and that's well evidenced. Research, so with research, we're talking about actually being able to find reliable sources and to be able to triangulate evidence. Analyse, to examine, compare, contrast. Evaluate, so appraise validity, so again looking at how they may critique their reading. Assessing pros and cons, justifying a position, which is something they're going to have to do in their essay. The writing of an essay itself, so how you structure an argument. The appropriate way to write, so using academic language and plain language, and how to write effective paragraphs, and what an introduction does and what a conclusion does. And we've got citing, so how they support arguments, how they format quotes, how they paraphrase, when it's actually appropriate to cite, and how they reference, so using the Harvard reference system and writing a reference list at the end of their essay. And then I've stuck metacognition in there because I think that's relevant for every single module, about their reflecting on their learning and self-assessment and how they can relate their own work to the generic criteria. So it's quite a lot of skills there, but I think they're all really important in this module, and we can use those to help deliver the content. So the content is almost a vehicle for learning these really important skills, which are transferable across to all subjects, really. Whilst we're not diving straight into lesson plans right now, I just think it might be useful to show you an example of how you can deliver new content and information whilst maintaining a strong focus on skills development. This might be something you do naturally already, but let's just take a look. It doesn't have to be either or. Combining skills and content delivery makes the learning more active and therefore more likely to stick. So we've got an example lesson again here. So the content picked out is new business models in the music industry, and I've decided to focus on 3 key skills here which are very closely related, so research, reading and referencing. And the intended learning outcomes I'll come up with kind of balance the 2 things. So summarise key features of new business models and research and reference a new business model using a reliable source. So the teaching and learning activities and assessment tasks that I've devised here to enable students to achieve these learning outcomes are: firstly, to give students a set piece of reading about a new business model, and ask the student to summarise key ideas. So here we're really focusing on that first learning outcome and trying to help them develop reading skills by encouraging them to actually understand and rephrase what they're reading about. And then we have a group discussion. So in this group discussion, I'll be encouraged to apply critical reading questions to set source. So is it reliable? So look at perhaps who wrote it, when it was published, where it was published, etc. to answer this question together. So in these tasks, there's quite a bit of scaffolding. So they're actually given a set piece of reading, and together they're supporting themselves through this discussion. And then we have a tutor demonstration. So the tutor shows how to reference the given source correctly. And then the students are kind of on their own. So now they have to go away, find an alternative, reliable source, asking the questions that they discussed together on critical reading, summarise key ideas again, and create a reference, so using the technique, the demonstration that the tutor gave earlier. And then they present it back to class for formative feedback, so they get some idea about how well they've achieved those tasks. And then we end with a little bit of reflective thought. So how difficult was it to find a reliable source? And then which new business model are you excited about and why? So here we're really covering the content because they're drawing a lot of knowledge and understanding from the reading that they're doing, but we're also developing those key skills at the same time. So throughout this process, you need to remember that you are not alone. If you are a module leader of a module with multiple tutors, this should definitely be a collaborative effort. We can only benefit from multiple perspectives on a certain topic. And this is absolutely essential if you run or you teach on a module where you have multidiscipline classes, so it splits off into guitar, bass, drums, vocals, etc. And whilst they will differ in many ways because you're teaching fundamentally very different things, the module goals are the same, the assessments are incredibly similar, and the students should have parity of experience on those modules. So please, please, please get together or use Skype for Business, catch up with your colleagues over summer and share drafts, share your key aims for the module. As the module leader, it's a good idea to send your scheme to the rest of your team, or perhaps your key termly goals to the rest of your team to give them some focus and know that they're heading in the right direction. I mean, it sounds really simple, but in the past we've definitely had issues with classes on the same module going for slightly different directions, and then the students end up in quite different places in their assessment, and that gets picked up in moderation, so it will help us avoid some headaches later on. And as for everybody else, I guess my question for you is, do you know what your colleagues teach on the course that you teach on? Especially in your subject area the year before and the year after, if that's relevant, and which modules, what's going on in the modules across the year that you're teaching on. If you don't know, it's a really good idea to reach out to your colleagues or speak to your course leader. We can make the current schemes of work available to you, so although they're likely to change, you'll have an idea of what's going on in those modules already. And when we have all the draft schemes in, what we can start to do is map out what each week for a student looks like, so we can show you what's going on in each module across the timetable. So what do you do now? Well, I would recommend that you start getting your rough ideas down about the content and skills that are required for success in the module. You might want to try a concept map, but whatever way works for you is totally fine. And then highlight which skills you think are the most important and the most challenging for students. So these are skills that you'll need to build into your attended learning outcomes regularly. And then you might want to sketch out a rough order of when you might deliver your content and introduce new skills. So this can change, but just to have an idea of how you might order things throughout the year. Excuse me. And this can be related to the concept of scaffolding and the student's zone of proximal development. So say you have 8 core skills across the year. It's not as simple as just having 8 lessons where you address each one of those skills, because to reach a level of mastery in those skills, it's going to be very difficult to actually get students through those levels of learning in one lesson. What you'll want to do is spread out activities that help students develop each of those skills across the whole year, and building on the complexity of what you want students to achieve as you go throughout the year. And so these notes will eventually form section 1 of your scheme of work. So what's next? So in the next video we will be taking a step back to step 3 and evaluating, reflecting on your previous experiences and the feedback from others in the planning of your scheme of work.